Welcome to a Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Fun to be here. Just came back from New York. It was very exciting in New York City. My daughter's company's kind of hot these days, and it was a fun time there. I spent my time at the New York Yacht Club. I want everybody who's a member of our yacht club and their guests to know that NYYC is incredibly happy to have a relationship with St. Francis Yacht Club. In honor of them, I kept wearing the white pants after I left their yacht club. Anyway, it was very fun to be in Midtown. One of the other benefits of the YC, and I've been going there literally for 50 years, is that you're right close to the theater district. So I went to a play at night and could walk back to your hotel room in the club. And that's pretty cool, that center of the city set up. Let's see a little bit about our speaker today. So it's a broad canvas that we have with the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. We get to cover everything maritime, from people winning the Around the World race to people, saving whales, to people who make sure that ships don't crash into bridges, and what happens if people, after they crash into bridges, how do they recover them? So you may recall that one of our speakers, Joe Farrell, about 2 months ago, came and spoke about how he was using his company to help Mary Crowley remove some of the junk that's in the North Pacific Gyre. That is twice the size of Texas, filled with old fishing nets and plastic bottles and so on. And we said at the time that he was an absolute pioneer in this space because he is incredibly capable at handling big disasters like that. Well, guess what? His company was dubbed to to surface the ship, the Dolly, which crashed into the bridge in Baltimore. And a couple days ago, he was in the news because it was his company that exploded the bridge to get it away from the ship. And I spoke to him yesterday in the afternoon about lifting the ship up and moving it out of the shipway. So he was a speaker just 2 months ago at our club. And he's agreed to be a speaker at the Lighthouse Talks up in Tinsley at our stag cruise. So that's fun. We'll get to ask him a zillion questions. Well, when you talk about people who actually have that kind of a background, it's great for us to understand that all types of folks are needed in this maritime environment that we have. And our speaker today personifies one aspect of that, as we'll learn. So few of us were born in San Francisco. Who else besides me was born in San Francisco? There we go. Mark Darcy, Micah Holden. We have several guests. That's great. Our speaker today was born in the St. Mary's Hospital, raised in Petaluma, which means he knows plenty about chickens. And his company, actually, his uncle and grandpa founded a livestock feed company up there, which is wonderful. Barlas Feed is a name known up in those days. Then his first boating experiences were taking, the Larkspur San Francisco ferry, and then he worked on a research team for 5 years that did seismic research. That means they're hunting for oil, so they use seismic research to find oil deposits under the water. And then he got the notion that he really wanted to get credentialed in that space, so he went to the Cal Maritime Academy. We've had speakers from the Cal Maritime Academy here at the club multiple times. We're proud of the Cal Maritime Academy. It's a really great academy. He did what you do in 4 years in 3 years, so he's a fast-moving young kid. He then worked for Foss Tugboats for a couple of years and is spending time in offshore shipping enterprise and earned his second mate's unlimited license. He's now accumulated 60,000 miles at sea. I've only got 40. Mark Darcy's chasing both of us, but 60 is a few miles at sea. And we want to welcome Josh Barlas to come up and tell us all about his game. Josh.
Appreciate it. All right, let me get my cards here. So I didn't have as much time to prepare, not because there wasn't time, but because I unexpectedly had to work the last week, so I got back to town yesterday. So, if I hadn't procrastinated, if I hadn't saved that week, I, would have been a little bit better off.
Stay close to that.
Thanks, Ron. So I'm going to talk about my trip to Antarctica. That's kind of like what makes me stand out as a sailor at the moment. I was invited here by John Bechtel, who is a family friend, and Ron. And so thanks for inviting me. And it's something I've been very excited to do because it's an experience that I'm proud of. So I took a 112-day voyage, began in Philadelphia, went to Antarctica, and then ended in California. So just so you know, this is the second time I've done this presentation. First time was at Montessori Preschool in Central Marin. And I can tell that you will be less well behaved than my first audience. So this is me at 20. You are welcome. My wife did not want me to use this picture, but I chose to anyways. So I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in literature from UC Santa Cruz. I also have a bachelor's from Cal Maritime. I have a teaching credential in English language. So, I'm just trying to sell myself a little bit. I, deserve your attention, right? So work history, offshore environmental consultant. This is me working on seismic research ships at 30. And so I also, as Ron mentioned, worked for Foss for a couple of years, Foss tugboats, doing offshore work, which I'll talk about. I worked with the MMP union. The union hall is in Oakland. You go in there, you ask them for a job, and if you're the person with the most seniority, they let you have a job. So that's how I got to work in Antarctica, and now I'm working for AmNav. It's a local tug outfit that does ship assist, helps the ships in and out of port, and I'm skipper training, so I'll be captaining my own boat here before long in San Francisco Bay. So credentials, second mate unlimited, master 1600 ton, master of tow oceans. That final credential, master of tow oceans, is the one I'm most proud of and allows me to do this job that I'm training for now. So Foss to MMP offshore. So I began my tugboat career with Foss after graduating Cal Maritime as an old person. So I graduated, I was non-traditional, as they say, which means old. Offshore towing, it's tramp work with a chaotic schedule. And as you can see from this picture, I accomplished a bucket list experience recently within the last couple of days. Kind of, my glory has been, tamped out a little bit by the local northern lights. But I saw this one in the Arctic. So I saw this above the Arctic Circle. And I write, when I'm underway, I write my wife letters every single day. And in a rare moment of poetic inspiration, my description of the Northern Lights was this. So I said, the effect of this was a kind of melancholy. There was a lugubriousness to the movement of the light, a meandering sort of lumbering march across the sky. The dynamism of movement meant that there could appear or disappear from one second to the next, but when observed, the movement seemed slow. Coupled with that was the fact that the vapors seemed to slowly evaporate skyward in a constantly rising mist. The vertical light rising toward the heavens and vanishing, the green color was simultaneously vibrant and solemn and seemed barely willing to announce its existence within the mist. And yet the grandeur and majesty of it preferred an eternal quality, as if those bands of light had been engaged in the march long before we arrived and would continue long after we go. So, in case you're wondering, that's how I feel about sailing. That's how I feel about being on the water. So, Red Dog Mine, my first Alaska job with Foss was at the Red Dog Mine. This is the largest pit mine in the world, major source of lead and zinc ore. The mine is 40 miles inland. It's in the Arctic Circle, so when I arrived, it was daylight 24 hours a day. The mine with an ice road to a natural harbor, and that harbor is too shallow for ships, so in order to move the ore, Foss tugboats designed a way to convey it in two barges. So you see the barge here. Here you see the barge. It's cut off a little bit, but it's tying up to a ship over here. And this is the pit mine right there. So the barges are ferried back and forth to bulker ships waiting a couple miles offshore. That was the job. So as a deckhand, here I am there I am there, working my butt off. I would work on the barge for 2 to 3 hours, making tow, riding the barge to a ship or back to the harbor, and breaking tow. And then I would get 2 hours sleep between each job. So it's about 3 hours work, 2 hours sleep, 24 hours a day. I was grueling work and I was injured while I was out there, but that's not what I'm here to talk about, so if you're curious, ask me about it. So I spent another year working on the Aleutian chain. That's the Alaskan peninsula. Mostly towing a fuel barge to unimaginably tender and remote fuel docks. The island chain is the meeting place between the Baltic and Pacific and can be treacherous. I navigated the boat under tow through numerous narrows and infamous passes. I visited Adak, the westernmost populated space in the U.S. is Adak. This is also Adak. I saw an active volcano spewing lava. The land was mostly tundra with little vegetation, and it was grueling work. Little tundra except for Kodiak, which is exceptionally beautiful. These are little huts. They're prefab houses that the military built when they had a station in Adak. That's all been abandoned now, and it belongs to indigenous tribes. The population there since the military, since the Navy shut down its base, has gone from like 3,000 to like less than 100. But fishing boats still fuel there, so they still needed fuel. So, oops. This should start automatically, but it's not. Oops, no. Sorry, this is a video, but it's not playing. QuickTime not available. Huh. Okay, well, so streaming tow out of Adak, I had a flight to return to Alaska mid-November, but the boats couldn't wait for me in Dutch Harbor. My boss, so this is an image of us streaming tow. That's the fuel barge that we were towing, and in the video, this boat is kind of pulling out ahead of it. We've just made up to the barge, and it's kind of falling in line behind the boat. And that's on Adak. So you can see that landscape, that barren landscape behind us is Adak. So I had a flight to return to Alaska mid-November of 2022. But the boat couldn't wait for me in Dutch Harbor. They've got a window of opportunity before, when the weather is good, when they can leave or stay. And my boss called to tell me just a day or maybe two before I was supposed to catch my flight that the boat wasn't going to wait for me. My opposite, who's a friend of mine, would finish out the season, and Foss would find something else for me to do. So I was kind of relieved because I didn't really like it. The seas are really miserable there. It's a tough run. So that same day, I went and visited the MMP Union Hall. And I saw an open job on the board, which was third mate sailing as an AB on the Ocean Giant. So this is listed as a 90-day job on the board in the Union Hall. And it was only after I asked, it didn't say what the destination was, but I found out it was Antarctica. So I took the job, and I was on a flight to Philadelphia 2 days later. So if you can imagine your husband or wife choosing to leave for 3 months, maybe I could have done it better, probably. I could have done it. So my voyage, the Ocean Giant is a heavy lift ship owned and operated by SeaCor. Heavy lift means that it has its own cranes to operate its own cargo, or to load and unload its own cargo. Because it's designed to handle its own cargo via these 3 pedestal cranes, by nature the ship can go to unusual ports and deliver unusual things, right? So that's tramp shipping, meaning it goes all over the world delivering cargo, working on a contractual basis and without a regular run. So that's the definition of tramp shipping, and that's the cool thing about this ship is it went everywhere. The ship had just dropped off large sections of one of the academy training ships. So they're building new ships for all of the maritime academies, and this ship had just delivered parts for that ship before I boarded. So that's what I was dealing with when I got on. The days in Philadelphia were spent laboring. This is at the Port of Philadelphia. Yeah, I think so. And we had to prepare to load cargo in California. So we were also going to be underway for 3 weeks to get there. This meant moving a lot of heavy things by hand, and it also meant a lot of crane operations and cleaning massive cargo holds. So this other thing about this is you can see on the ship that the cargo holds are beneath the hatch covers here, and they're just massive open bays. So they're huge kind of warehouse-sized spaces that we had to clean. I loved it. I spent my 42nd birthday in Philadelphia, and we have family there, so I visited family also. So sailed down the Atlantic coast and through Panama Canal. This is the second time I transited the canal. The first was Pacific to Atlantic and nighttime. This time we sailed Atlantic to Pacific in the daytime. And in each case, I was at the helm. I was steering as we entered and exited the locks. Line handlers board the ship when we approach the canals, along with the pilots, and then they assist during transit, so they kind of do all the work for us. The workers on shore pass wires, as you can kind of see here, down to the ship itself, and use these locomotives, and you can see the railroad tracks there, to pull us through the canal. So that's how the large ships get through the canal. So we then sailed across Gatun Lake, which is up here, exceptionally beautiful. It's the first time I got to see it during the daytime. It's a man-made lake from a dam that powers and supplies water to the canal. And then we descend through another set of locks on the other side. So cargo was loaded at the Navy dock in Port Hueneme. So we spent approximately 1 week in Hueneme, and I had arranged for Ariel, my wife, to come down and visit me. We rented a room for 3 nights, but the ship was tied up at a Navy dock, and they were strict about entering and exiting the property. So the port was mostly locked down, and we relied on Navy security to open gates for us. My first day there, I walked a mile to the primary kiosk, and I explained to the guard that I was hoping to come and go freely because my wife was visiting. I hadn't seen her for a month, and felt like that should be enough. And he said, no. He said, you can't come and go. And I argued with him because I felt like that was an unreasonable answer. And he yelled at me, with a gun in his hand. So that was enough. But I got the upper hand because I got the number of his boss, and I arranged for guards to open our local gate for us whenever we called them. So it worked out in my favor, and of course I got to spend time with my wife when I was there. So this is me. This is my watch-keeping gear here. So we crossed the international date line and the equator on our way to Lyttelton, New Zealand from Port Hueneme. Those were each new maritime milestones for me, so that was pretty exciting. And then this is the New Zealand harbor and dock where we loaded more cargo for New Zealand. That's also where we fueled, had a few repairs done. This video works. Okay, cool. So I spent most of my hours doing day work, shipping and painting. So I was an AB, I was a deckhand doing physical labor on the ship most of the time. So you can see this is the kind of thing we're doing, just knocking rust off of metal. Our greatest accomplishment was cleaning and painting the bases of the 3 pedestal cranes. So you got a nice racing stripe up there. Yeah. And that was my bosun right there. That was Bosun Rich, one of the best sailors I've ever worked with. I would have done anything for him. He is one of my favorite people to sail with. And then we crossed the South Seas on our way to McMurdo Station. So, though it's unorthodox, I was able to complete a block print underway. So I also like to make art in my spare time. Ariel, my wife, had brought me some art supplies when she visited in Hueneme, and I designed this image based on the ship, on the Ocean Giant. You can see the 3 cranes. And I rigged a printing press using the engine room's shop press here. So it was extremely nice of the engineers to allow me this luxury. This is not something that they would normally do. But they got some free artwork out of it, so everybody was happy. And they were so happy that they decided they wanted me to make them a mural on the wall of the engine room. So this mural exists today on the wall of the engine room, the Ocean Giant, SeaCor's Ocean Giant. It's a stencil, so I cut out all those black parts out of a big chart, a navigational chart, and I made posters for the crew with the same stencil. So Antarctica. So though John advised me to kind of keep this sea story focused, I wanted to tell you a little bit about just like the political history in Antarctica, just so you get a context of where I was at. Also, this is a picture of the continent that I took. That is Erebus, Mount Erebus. It's an active volcano, and you can see the smoke is always coming out of the top of the volcano. So, the International Geophysical Year. So the systematic exploration, systematic meaning not just kind of like achievement-oriented, right, like magnetic South Pole, geographical South Pole. When we actually decided that we were going to map out all of the continent, that began in 1957 during the International Geophysical Year. 35 scientific stations were established on the Antarctic continent with another 15 on sub-Antarctic islands by 12 different nations. The IGY, International Geophysical Year, was followed by a year of international geophysical cooperation when the 12 nations invested here: Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, United Kingdom, USA, and USSR decided to continue their research. So if you notice, that's East and West. This is a rare moment during the Cold War when everybody was on the same page. So, concerned with the spread of the Cold War, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower convened an Antarctic conference of the 12 countries active in Antarctica to sign a treaty. So representatives of the 12 nations met in Washington, D.C. in 1959 to draft and sign the Antarctic Treaty. This agreement dedicated the entire continent to peaceful scientific investigation, and it came into effect in 1961, at which time all territorial claims were suspended, so no one gets to own the land. In 1991, 24 nations approved a protocol to the treaty that would ban oil and other mineral exploration for at least 50 years, which came into force in 1998 and stands until 2048. So there are now 52 countries that have signed the Antarctic Treaty, which represents 80% of the world's population. And the result is that it's one of the few places that has never been affected by war, where the environment is fully protected, and the priority is scientific research. So it's a unique place for that reason. And I like the history. I think it's kind of cool. So crossing the South Seas, I'm going to just read a passage. You'll see this is the pack ice. This is what is really deadly and treacherous. This is our ship here, and then that's the Polar Star, Coast Guard icebreaker ahead of us. So Alfred Lansing wrote about Ernest Shackleton's experience on the ship the Endurance, which shipwrecked in this ice pack, this stuff here. And he wrote, "The whole surface of the ice was chaos of movement. It looked like an enormous jigsaw puzzle, the pieces stretching away to infinity and being shoved and crunched together by some invisible but irresistible force. The impression of its titanic power was heightened by the unhurried deliberateness of the motion. Wherever two thick floes came together, their edges butted and ground against one another for a time. Then, when neither of them showed signs of yielding, they rose slowly and often quiveringly, driven by the implacable power behind them. Sometimes they would stop abruptly as the unseen force affecting the ice appeared mysteriously to lose interest. More frequently, though, the two floes, often 10 feet thick or more, would continue to rise, tensing up until one or both of them broke and toppled over, creating a pressure ridge." So that's the environment we're sailing through.
Josh.
Oh, sorry, thank you. We first saw icebergs before seeing any pack ice, certainly before seeing the continent itself. Most of the bergs in these pictures are more than a mile in diameter. Some can be over 100 miles across, which is the size of a small state. They calve off of glaciers and can float for years before melting in warmer waters. The icebergs they can float for many years. The icebergs travel in the Antarctic circumpolar current, or west wind drift, flowing clockwise, as seen from the South Pole, so west to east, around Antarctica. The current is circumpolar because it's uninterrupted by landmass, and that keeps warm ocean waters away from Antarctica and enables the continent to maintain its huge ice sheet. It also means that because the currents are uninterrupted by land, you get some of the biggest rollers in the world as you cross from the northern continents into Antarctica. It's treacherous seas. So, meeting with the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star, the Polar Star, this is a quote from the Coast Guard's website, is the United States' only heavy icebreaker, commissioned in 1976. She was built by Lockheed Shipbuilding, along with her now decommissioned sister ship, Polar Sea. 3 aviation-grade gas turbine engines provide USCG Polar Star with up to 75,000 horsepower, making her the most powerful ship in the U.S. Coast Guard fleet. Each year, Polar Star travels to McMurdo Station, Antarctica, to lead Operation Deep Freeze and break miles of ice up to 21 feet thick. So you were just watching it breaking the ice around our ship. So, interesting, I had already visited the Polar Star as a student of Cal Maritime and had seen the turbine engines in her engine room. And so sailing behind her felt like a kind of karmic loop. We weren't allowed to take pictures of the engine room, but this is her in dry dock. So the Polar Star spent weeks, let's see if it goes. The Polar Star spent weeks cutting this channel through the ice because, before we arrived, because McMurdo wasn't ready for us, we had to spend a night at the side of the ice channel. We created the only breaks in this massive unbroken sheet of ice, and through the night, which was daylight because the sun never set, minke whales would pop up every couple of minutes through the unbroken ice, or through the broken ice. So we had this kind of evening with the whales popping up for breath all around us. These are penguins. You can kind of get a sense of what they're supposed to be doing. Yes, this is Antarctica. Yeah, everything is vertical. You just walk on walls. Yeah. So, running from the ship here, a bunch of penguins. So we got to see a lot of wildlife. Here's a killer whale. So very, very unique wildlife down there too. It's a very cool experience. Stakeholders. So again, I think it's worth talking about the various folks who are working down there and employed to kind of keep McMurdo Station running. So the National Science Foundation is the number one. In regards to McMurdo, this is their project. They employ all the scientists and determine the type of research being done. They were also the logistical coordinators for cargo, organizing which containers were offloaded and which trucks would pick them up, where they'd be taken. And they had a shack within view of the ship right over here and right over here, actually. Now, it's this orange thing up there. So that's where the NSF, kind of bigwigs were hanging out, looking at the ship from those little towers and telling the longshoremen what to do. So though I didn't fly into McMurdo, meaning this is not my picture, I didn't personally meet any Air Force personnel. They were responsible for international logistics. So the Air Force is kind of the military branch that is the organizer of the whole thing. And as such, they manage the other military branches that were present on the island. And they transport all the civilians as well. So this is the civilian transport, the civilian employees. So the Coast Guard, I mentioned some of these details before, but the Polar Star arrived months before us and had been at work breaking up the ice channel for us to sail through when we arrived. So I traded some swag with some of the guys on the Polar Star and came home with some patches and a coin, Polar Star coin. It was cool. Army, so the Army owned and maintained this floating dock. So this is a floating dock here. The pieces were manipulated, so each of these is the size of a standard shipping container, or it's the width and length of a shipping container. So they can be stacked on the ship very easily. And so we brought this with us. We unloaded it, and these guys who are all in the Army, this is their tug right there, which we also brought with us. They put it together. I got to know these guys pretty well. I was on gangway watch quite a bit, and so we had the gangway hanging over onto the floating dock, and just depending on list, depending on our draft, the gangway would want to go into the water, and I needed the Army to help me keep it from happening. Navy, so the Navy Seabees, or the construction battalion, they're the longshoremen, and you can see these guys up here. They're standing on some construction material that we're bringing down. They operated the cranes and were responsible for offloading cargo. And so I saw these guys every day. And they, I'd been a high school teacher at a certain point, and these guys were just like my students. Yes. So, arriving at McMurdo Station. So this is a docking schematic, and I'll come back to this schematic again. But this is how we tied up to the floating dock. So the ice dock, we originally tied up to the ice dock to discharge the floating dock. The ice dock is remade every 5 or so years and is constructed by pouring water on top of water into a massive mold in a sub-zero environment. So the result is a platform. This is it here, and this is actually it behind me there, that can be tied to the shore, that trucks can drive onto, and that a ship can dock alongside. But when the ice dock was breaking up this year and had suffered from the warmer climate, so we still tied up alongside it, but just long enough to discharge the floating dock. I used a pneumatic line thrower to get our line ashore. It launched a tagline stowed in that cylinder, in the cylinder of that rocket, like 500 feet to shore, and 20 or so volunteers at shore then hauled the mooring lines onto shore. The line thrower had a stronger recoil than I anticipated, and that gun shot backwards out of my hands, so a little embarrassing. The Seabees discharged the floating dock that we brought aboard using our own cranes. So here's the cranes. They're the tugs and the floating dock on the ship, and here they are constructing the floating dock. And so once they moved the floating dock to shore, we had to move the ship. And so this is the docking schematic for the ship. Our longest spring line here is 650 feet long. That's very long. This one was probably just under that, maybe 600 feet. And we had an ice pilot who had sailed with us from Hueneme. Ice pilot, he's very specialized, very essential member of the crew, but he decided that he was going to tell us how to tie up the ship and what lines to send first. He wanted us to send this line first, which wasn't attached to it wasn't fixed to the drum. We had to wind it around the drum ourselves and then make it off by hand. So when you have 600 feet of mooring line draped over the water, you cannot make it off by hand. It will slip away. You'll lose all your tension. It won't do anything for you. And so what we needed to do was put this line up first, which was fixed to the drum. It wasn't going to ever leave the ship. You could just wind it up, maintain the tension, no problem. But he was very insistent and came down and actually tried to do the job for us. Not professional. For a pilot's place is in the wheelhouse. So, but he was a great guy, and we let him know he was not right in this case, and should go back. So alongside, the trucks were able to drive out onto the floating dock, as you can see here. The longshoremen would work the ship's cranes to move the containers and other cargo from the ship onto the trucks. There were about 70 Seabees in total. You can see them standing around down here, working in 2 12-hour shifts. So much of the work that would have been streamlined in a traditional port was accomplished via manpower. I mean, these guys were always just humping stuff all over the place. So exploring McMurdo Station. So, actually once we got to the station, we got to leave the ship, we got to go cruise around, check out the station, and check out the continent a little bit, the island at least. So here's the sign, here's our ship, 3 pedestal cranes, and you can see the earth is all black. It's volcanic basalt. So McMurdo Station reminded me in certain ways of summer camp because there's not much to do, and because the types of young travelers and young academics who choose to spend a season there, the station employs event coordinators to organize activities. So as you can see from the dry erase board, there were art classes, which they had a small art studio, athletic activities, lectures, religious services, and the chapel was beautiful, especially considering they didn't have much to make it with. So there were also bars and coffee houses. The bars were closed while we were delivering cargo, ostensibly for safety's sake, but clearly this was a prejudice against sailors. And probably justified. They're not well behaved. So this is a picture of their dormitory hall. So the mess hall and dormitory halls were lined with glass display cases detailing the history of the island and of McMurdo Station. So they provided details on geology, early explorers, scientific research, historic artifacts, things like that. And the structure here is a Quonset hut. It's one of the oldest at McMurdo Station, and that's their coffee house. They had free-use bicycles just on racks in several different places. You can see the Polar Star, the icebreaker back here, and the chapel is right around this corner, and you can see it in these pictures. I will say I failed to take pictures of these chapels, so this is, free-use pictures. But that's what it looks like. It's pretty cool. So this was, the coffee house was run by volunteers who worked for tips. So this was my favorite place at McMurdo Station. I spent hours, as many hours as I could at these tables, writing my journal, drinking espresso, and just people watching. I've been in coffee shops all over the world, and this was one of the most special. All the wood paneling, the bars, the shelves, the decor were made by McMurdo residents who just wanted to improve their environment, right? They're stuck out there. They want to beautify what they've got. So unfortunately, the Quonset hut is slated for demolition, as is the chapel, as part of the Antarctic Infrastructure Modernization for Science project. This is a real name. It's representative of kind of a perceived gentrification down there, a bureaucratization of the island, and people feel like it's a loss of culture there. They kind of resent it. I think it would be a loss. I mean, this was the coolest place to hang out. So, helicopter hangar, another very cool place that I got to check out. The ship's crew were treated really well. We were dignitaries at McMurdo Station. Our chief engineer was a particularly friendly guy, unusual for chief engineers. Just so you know, I don't know if any of you have worked with engineers, but they're not usually the easiest to get along with. But our chief engineer was great, and he was kind of a liaison for the crew. He offered all the residents that he came across and made friends with tours of our ship, and in return, we got tours of all sorts of different facilities. So one of my favorites was the helicopter hangar, and here you can see they actually made a little rock polisher. So this is a homemade kind of polishing machine that they could play with, and they were bored out there. So Operation Deep Freeze, because the key purpose for McMurdo's existence is this research, Operation Deep Freeze is the name given to kind of the military arm of that research. And it began in 1957, the geophysical year. So according to Coast Guard press release, Operation Deep Freeze is the annual logistical support mission provided by the Department of Defense to the National Science Foundation, managed by the U.S. Antarctic Program, and is a unique mission demonstrating U.S. commitment to the Antarctic Treaty and to research programs conducted for the betterment of all humanity. Essentially, it's the code name for the military support of the NSF's research down there. So what's being researched? Ice cores. Though scientists in McMurdo study many things unique to that environment, like geology, psychology, biology, the climate research being done is paramount and is dependent on these ice cores. And this is actually an ice core that was shown to us at their facilities down there. We got to tour the science lab, and we were shown some of the ice cores. So according to the NSF, this is a picture from the NSF storage facility, so not my own picture. Because of their high time resolution, the physical nature of their historical records, and their ability to achieve actual greenhouse gas concentrations, to archive actual greenhouse gas concentrations, ice cores have become one of the gold standards in paleoclimate research. So the oldest continuous ice core records extend to 800,000 years, and were taken off the Antarctic continent. McMurdo was responsible for the oldest contiguous ice core at over 3,400 meters before being surpassed by, who surpassed us, who do you think? Russians. In 2012, when they reached 3,770 meters. I couldn't believe that we were transporting these blocks of ice, hundreds of thousands of years old, back to the U.S. So, of course, I got to explore the island as well. That was the funnest part of being there. So here I am, exploring. Looking cool. So the crew of the Ocean Giant were required to attend a safety lecture before going out on our own. The meeting stipulated that if we were going to be taking a longer hike, we needed to check in with the comms station, borrow radio, bring pee bottles, because it's forbidden to pee on the ground in Antarctica, and more. So this map indicates the trails all around the station. So the station's down here, and this is the longest trail, and I hiked all of them. I made sure to see everything. Scott's Hut, only around 1,000 people a year are allowed. They actually have a quota to enter Scott's Hut. A few folks on cruise ships can make it over there, but mostly it's the folks at McMurdo. Famed explorer Captain Scott camped out before attempting to reach the geographic South Pole. I believe this was in 1913. Scott wanted to be the first human ever to complete the journey to the geographic South Pole, and after departing this hut, he and his crew did manage to reach that destination, only to find a handwritten note. Dear Captain Scott, as you are probably the first to reach this area after us, I will ask you to kindly forward this letter to King Hakon VII. If you can use any of the articles left in this tent, please do not hesitate to do so. With kind regards, and wish you a safe return, yours truly, Roald Amundsen. So there's the sad postscript here is that Scott and his party died on the way back, and their bodies remain in the Antarctic continent. So not only were they not the first to make it, they did not return. So Observation Hill has a commemorative memorial dedicated to Scott. This was the first big hike I took, and the small peak is at the perimeter of McMurdo Station, so very close to the station itself. And then the cross was in commemoration of Scott and the other men who perished with him on his expedition, and the view was amazing. And I hiked this with the third mate, Austin. So I also went to Castle Rock. That first image that you saw of me kind of standing on that big tall rock was here, so I set off with Mike, the third assistant engineer. Here he is. This is an emergency little hut. So they have supplies, water, things like that in these little huts that kind of dot the trail. There's 2 or 3 of them along the way. We had to begin at the comms building. They gave us a radio. We also had to check back in when we returned the radio, and that's how they kept track of us. It was the longest hike up to Castle Rock and about 11-mile loop. And we began in near whiteout condition. This was actually a pretty snowy day, and so you just had to mark your position by flags that mark the trail. So you could see the next flag and you can make it to the next flag. Then we had to scramble up the rock face. Literally, there are lines fixed to the rock. You could not get up it without having to climb, using that to climb. And so it was kind of exciting. There's some risk involved. Let's see if this video works. Nope. So this is a video of the view that we had there. And then the last hike that I made was to Arrival Heights. This was about a 5-mile loop, and I did it alone on the day before we departed. I found the continent breathtaking, but I also liked the geology of it. This black rock was just so neat. And if you found rocks at the ridge of a crest or hill, they were polished by the wind. They had been there for, thousands of years, right? So thousands of years of wind and ice kind of polished them to a smooth, dull gloss. Unfortunately, visitors aren't supposed to take anything back from the continent, so I admired the rocks. There was also one other prize. The great prize would have been an Erebus crystal. So that's Erebus crystals there they are there. So I learned my first day on the trip that while touring the dormitory and looking at the display cases, that there was a volcanic crystal called the Erebus crystal that was only produced in Mount Erebus. There are 3 volcanoes in the world that produce volcanic crystals. The other 2 are Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro. They each have distinct crystals. So this is unique to the continent, unique to that single volcano. And they explode out of the volcano encased in volcanic glass, which looks like that. They're called phenom bombs. And those fall on the ground, the glass erodes away, and it leaves the crystals just laying on the volcano. So they are only produced when the volcano is active. I believe the last time Erebus produced them was in '86. And I figured that made it one of the rarest crystals possible to find. So I just scoured the ground for them, but by my final hike, I realized that the explosion hadn't reached McMurdo Station. Regardless, I decided that the only folks I knew who might have access to Mount Erebus itself were the helicopter pilots. So I went to the helicopter pilot station and made some small talk and had my tour, and I noticed that they had a little rock polishing station, and I offered them some art for the Erebus crystals, and they agreed to make a trade. So, of course, it would be illegal for these to come back home with me, but there they are in my hand right there. So, thank you very much. That's my talk, and feel free to ask me any questions, and I really appreciate it.
Great going.
Thanks, Ron.
Great.
Hopefully it didn't take too long.
You did perfect.
Okay.
So, just as a reminder of next couple weeks, our speakers will be Brittany Hardy will be here from Earth Justice Oceans Program. So you're wondering if somebody pollutes the earth, who sues? Well, you're going to hear from those folks because Earth Justice will be here to talk about it next year. And then on the 29th of May, we will have an electric boat show. Literally, electrification is coming to boats, all forms, from little small speedboats to ferry boats, and not just new boats, but boats that are being retrofitted with electric engines from diesel or gas or whatever. So Repower representatives will be here too. So we'll have a panel of speakers. I will be racing down the coast, so I won't be here. But the boat show is going to happen, and we're going to have boats at the dock. You'll be invited to come from 11:30 on to look at the boats, physically go down, get on them. We're going to have little speedboat rides of you on electric boats. So it'll be a really fun event to come to, fun WYL. I wish I was going to be here, but I'm going to be racing on part of the Southern California 300 in preparation for the Pac Cup. I'm going to race across on an Andrews 57 to Hawaii in July. We got to practice to go down the coast. And then on June 5th, a real fun, Charlie Doan, longtime editor of Cruising World magazine, will be here, and he'll be in Sail magazine, and he'll be here to talk about this amazing sort of vagabond sailor and his adventurous story. So he's written a novel about this sailor, and you'll get to hear all about the boy who fell to shore. A very strange and fun talk. So enough about future speakers. So Josh, what a great presentation. So much of interest to talk to somebody who's actually, making things happen in research out there and in the commercial side. We listen to sailors, but actually they're always having to watch out for the commercial side. You guys actually have priority on the race course and everywhere else in the world. So let me ask you, when you saw that ship crash into the Dolly, crash into the bridge in Baltimore Harbor, did you say to yourself, there was no tug accompanying that ship?
I did. Yes, that is exactly what I said. Yeah.
And so now this is a big ship. What were this? Give me some of the dimensions that you know about that ship.
So the ship, I believe, is 600, 700 feet long. So it's not the hugest container ship, but of course had its own cranes. I don't know. I mean, diesel engines, controllable pitch, propellers, which means that the prop is always spinning at the same speed, and it's the pitch of the propeller
that changes the drive and speed.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So now, if you were in such a ship and you were a mile off of a stationary pedestal for a bridge, and you're going at like 4 knots or something else like that, what would be the turning radius by the ship, and then what would be the turning radius if you had, let's just say, one tug? Because there's a big difference if you're tug accompanied.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the turning radius. I didn't study like the compass card or anything like that.
Wait, new speaker.
I mean, I can give you my clinic on the Baltimore accident, though, if you want to hear.
Yeah, we do want to hear that. And first of all, answer the question, how long would it take to turn the ship, let's say, one width off its course?
I mean, it wouldn't take much to turn the ship so that it was heading from a space between the spans to one of the spans itself, right? Like that takes nothing. To turn the steering wheel just a little bit, turn the wheel, suddenly you're, heading towards something.
If you're a mile away and you have control of the wheel, but you can't change the engines, you can still keep the ship away from.
Yeah, if you've got wash going over your,
rudder.
Thank you very much. I'm losing it. So if you've got water going over the rudder, you can steer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And now, if a tug was stationed with the ship and at the stern of the ship, which it might have been, it would have basically turned the stern one way or the other to basically change the direction of the ship. What would it have been?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess so. A lot of this also depends on how fast the ship is going.
4 knots.
Yeah, so it probably didn't have much steerage way at that point. So even with 4 knots worth of water going over the rudder, it's not going to have a ton of effect. But of course, yeah, a tugboat is steering for a ship that's going that slow.
So for those who don't know, when you're going slow in any boat, the rudder has less control. That's why tugs are especially important docking big ships. The slower the boat's going, the slower the water going by the rudder, hence less effectiveness of the rudder. And so people that I've spoken to, and we're going to hear more about this in future talks, have said had that ship been accompanied by a tug, it wouldn't have mattered if they lost all power at all. Literally, if they lost all power, they could have the tug could have turned the ship enough to miss anything, even in less than a mile, they said.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so now talk to us a little bit about the size of ships that you've been on. From what size to what size have you been a deckhand?
So the last ship I was on, I was the third mate on the President Wilson, and that ship was about 1,000 feet long, about astern. So that was a bigger container ship. There's even bigger out there. So that's the largest that I've been on. So, the seismic research vessels probably varied from, 200 feet to 600 feet.
And now I forgot to introduce some very important people, and I want to do that right off the bat. Right off the bat, you wouldn't be here were it not for a lady who was your mother, and she is present here today. Can you thank her, please?
Yeah. So thank you, Jay. Jay made this happen. She introduced me to John, and that was how I kind of ended up being asked to do this.
Okay, great. And she's your mom?
She is. Yeah.
So she did more than introduce you to John?
Yes. She also has raised me. Yes.
Okay, great. Is your wife here?
My wife, Ariel, is here. Yes.
Let's see a hand, Ariel. Okay, you're there at the shore when this guy takes off for 3 months at a time. Whoa! Holding the camp. I wouldn't be able to have as much fun as I have up here were it not for my fiance, Christine Mumfrey. She's here too. Christine, sweetie pie. Okay, so back to questions about the size of things. What are the biggest waves you've seen at sea?
I'll tell a wave story. So sea stories. I was working in seismic in the North Atlantic. We were on a seismic research vessel looking for oil. That was what those ships did. And I was me and a couple of guys from my crew, we were contractors. We were going to leave. We weren't members of the ship's crew. They didn't need us to operate the vessel. So when the ship was leaving to return from the North Atlantic off the coast of Halifax, Canada, to go south, right? The season had ended. The weather was not going to be good enough to continue to work. They had to drop us off, right? We were going to stay in Halifax. So the day that we were supposed to crew change, we were supposed to move from that ship to a crew boat. And we probably had about 15, 20-foot swells, which isn't unimaginable in most cases, but they needed to deploy a small workboat to transfer us from the ship to the crew boat. So that's incredibly perilous, actually. It's very dangerous, unwise to do. But we did it anyways. So the ship had three options. Either we get off right then and there and take this kind of perilous step, or we sail with the rest of the crew down to Florida where they're going to have their crew change. So that means keeping us on board for another 2 weeks maybe, which they didn't want to do. They didn't want to pay us for 2 more weeks of work. And the other option was to hang out and have the whole crew miss their crew change or have their crew change delayed because we were waiting for weather. So, the option was, we're kind of expendable. So they, and we had a huge crew-wide meeting, and I was kind of managing the guys who were going to be going with me. Of course, the ship's crew, 2 of the mates, were going to be operating the workboat. And I asked the captain in front of the crew, is this safe? And he said, you can stop it if you want. So with, 40 sets of eyes looking at me at the time, I said, no, we'll go ahead. We'll go through with it. The boat descended into these 20-foot rollers, and the moment that the boat hit the water, this little motor boat, the ship disappeared. We were just in walls of ocean, right? And the coxswain couldn't steer the boat up the swells. He couldn't steer out of the trough. So we're just moving through the trough, but he does manage to navigate it around to the crew boat, right? So we get alongside the cruise ship. They had a davit that could, pull our workboat up alongside. And again, 15 feet, that davit is descending down to our little boat and then returning 20 feet up in the air and descending down.
The davit is a crane that's used to pull boats on board.
Yes. So the hook is there, and I'm watching the coxswain, and he's watching the hook with me and with our 2 other crewmates who are leaving that day. And I watch him, and the davit hook comes down, and he just goes click and puts it in. And I look up, and the crew of the crew boat is screaming at us, "No, no!" And before you know it, we're flying out of the water. We're 20 feet in the air, swinging alongside the ship. So that was probably one of the more dangerous things I've ever done. Everyone was safe. We made it on board. But when we got on board, I actually got scolded by the crew boat's crew. They said, you should have never done it. You shouldn't have let your guys get on there. That was insane. We couldn't believe you were even considering it.
So Richard Henry Dana got famous for writing 2 years before the mast. Kind of your experience back in the 1850s. Crew guys on those days were sailing square riggers. Do you ever read those old stories about, people like that had your job 200 years ago?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was a literature major. I was fascinated by sea stories long before I ever went out onto the ocean, and continue to read as many stories as possible. To prepare for this trip, I read every Antarctic exploration saga I could find. Yeah.
Wonderful. So talk to us now. The number of people on ships has been being reduced and reduced and reduced. So talk to us first about how many people are on a 1,000-foot ship, depending on what kind. That varies. And then give us, secondly, the org chart on the ship. So first of all, size of crew, and secondly, the org charts. Let's say a 1,000-foot container ship. Take that first.
Yeah, so we had, I think, a 22-person crew, 21, 22 people. We had 4 officers, not including the captain. The chief mate wasn't a watchstanding officer, so they had 2 third mates and a second mate. Everybody worked 4 hours on, 8 hours off on the bridge, steering the ship. Similar makeup in the engine room. And then you have a galley crew and your deckhands, the guys that do deck maintenance and help you tie up the ship, do the labor, which was my job on the Ocean Giant. In that, so on the President Wilson, I sailed from Oakland to Yokohama, Japan, to Busan, South Korea, Qingdao, and Shanghai. And so that means that I was a watch standing officer as a third mate in the busiest waters in the world. So I was able to navigate a 1,000-foot ship through the most heavily trafficked waters in the world on my own. Again, extremely scary experience, but I didn't call the captain. Yeah.
So if there's 20 guys on the crew, what are the watch sizes and what are the watch systems?
We have one guy, there's an officer who's the watch stander, and then there's a deckhand or an AB who is his helmsman and also a watch stander, right, who is someone who's looking out. So those two people are the eyes and ears on the bridge at any given moment, and they're both supposed to be attentive to what's going on. So, for example, when I was going through that heavy traffic as a third mate, my watch partner, who was a 40-year veteran AB named Paul, who liked to let me know anytime I did anything wrong, he would be at the helm. So he would be steering, and I'd be giving him helm commands and letting him know what course to take, mostly on autopilot. But if we were getting close to traffic, then we would put it into hand steering, and he'd be,
So what about AIS? Are you using AIS, and when do you see ships that don't use their AIS?
So AIS is an identification system for ships. You see it on your electronic charts, and you can also see it on your radar if that function is turned on to the radar. So you've got a number of ways to identify traffic around you. AIS is constantly used. We're advised not to use it as a primary means of like collision avoidance because the radar is more accurate. The AIS is, they transmit a signal every 6 seconds or something like that, giving a location, but it doesn't necessarily tell you the size of the ship. It's not necessarily placed in the right place on the ship. So maybe the ship's 1,000 feet and the AIS thinks it's at the bow, but it's actually at the stern. Then you've got 1,000 feet of extra ship that you might run into. So radar is the best way to avoid collisions, but AIS is just incredibly valuable. The only ships I've ever come across that don't use it are either small pleasure craft or military vessels. So now you haven't mentioned an area that has lots of pirates. Have you been anywhere where there are pirates? No. When I was doing seismic research in the Gulf of Mexico, though, I worked with guys who had done the same type of and I did work in Honduras as well. So Honduras was plagued by violence at the time, and we had to be very cautious. But I knew guys who had officers who had worked on, what was the name of the military contracting firm earlier?
Halliburton?
Was that?
Halliburton?
No, they would contract soldiers, Blackwater. So he had worked on a Blackwater ship, and he would get hired he was a third mate, and he would get hired to accompany ships traveling through Somalia and kind of along the coast there. And he said that it was mandatory for them to practice small arms every day. Yeah, and when he told me about the job, I'll just be honest, he said every guy he worked with was insufferable and he would never do it again. And that was pretty much, kind of killed that dream for me. I was like, I'll avoid the Blackwater ships.
So some years ago, Conrad Whittakin, who'd been a captain on ocean liners for his entire career, gave a talk at the WYL about being attacked off of Somalia by pirates. And they had sound blasters that they could use to ward away the pirates. However, they survived only because they left the pilot house and steered the ship remotely just before, like 20 minutes before, the pilot house was blown up by a shoulder-held grenade launcher. So Conrad gave a talk at the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon on being a skipper in pirate waters.
Yeah.
He said it's a pretty harrowing experience.
That'd be an adventure.
Now, you have 2 bachelor's degrees, a master's degree. You've taught school. What's the typical education of a deckhand that's your peer?
Well, I mean, educated at sea, right? Like there are a lot of deckhands, and they cover a span. There are guys who don't work and don't know anything and are happy in that place. And I've met guys who have read every book that I've read and, more, and wanted to talk about literature and wanted to talk about just the mythos of the sailor and stuff like that. So just a broad swath of humans.
So now one of the things that you have done that some of our speakers who are very famous going around the world and winning America's Cups and winning Olympic medals haven't done is you can splice, a 5-inch diameter hawser
Yes. Yeah.
Literally splice it.
Yes.
And those of us who are Sea Scouts learn to do that and do wire rope. But talk for us just a little bit about these hawsers. What's the strength of them? How long are they used? You talked about 600-foot lengths. How much are they coiled up? Talk to us about handling them.
So the line is, they've got incredibly strong line for tying up ships, for towing things like that. Now it's made of synthetic material. It used to be made of like natural fibers, and the synthetic material the strength is unimaginable. I don't have a specific number, but it'll still break. Usually it breaks not because of tension, but because of fraying, rubbing on sharp surfaces, things like that, because you can still cut through it. So when I was working in Alaska at the Red Dog Mine, again, the Red Dog Mine is kind of, it's a tugboating milestone. It's a kind of a big deal in the tugboating world. And I was on the barge, and we were bringing the barge back to shore, back to the harbor, when we parted one of the bridles. So there's two lines going from the tugboat to the barge itself, and you can imagine they're going to each corner of the barge. If one of those breaks, you're pulling on it funny, right? You can't bring it, you can't control it in the way you want. So we were on the barge watching the tugboat wheeling around uncontrollably on the one line after it lost its anchoring on the other line. And it was pretty scary. The one remaining line was right in front of me. So that's also, if that snaps, I'm in danger. So the captain, tried to get control. That line got tangled up. It took a minute to get out. It was one of the scarier things I've seen. And I was hiding, as everybody was who was around me. And so when I returned to the boat, they discovered they had spare lines and spare bridles, and they were able to put one up. That's what they had to do. The engineer was on deck, and he threw a line on, and we got it. We hauled it back onto the barge and hooked it up, and were able to bring the barge alongside. But that line was like 6 feet too long. So we had 2 hours between that job and the next job. And the captain, who was a tyrant, he was a really difficult captain, brings the crew together and says, "Who's going to fix the line? Who's going to cut 6 feet out of that line and fix it? You got 2 hours to do it." And I was the idiot who raised my hand for that job, because they pay overtime. And so I spliced the line that then worked for the rest of the season, towing that barge back and forth. And I've spliced many other lines. It's one of the deckhand. It's skill of the trade.
Now, when a ship comes into a foreign port, and when ships come into our port from abroad, they have to have a pilot on board, and the pilot usually gets on via a Jacob's ladder. And for those who don't know what a Jacob's ladder is, a line gets thrown over the side. It looks like a real wide ladder, and the pilot jumps onto the Jacob's ladder. Talk to us about, are they still using Jacob's ladders? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, there's all sorts of technology that you'd expect ships to have, like, advanced beyond, but they're still just rope ladders that they use for pilots. They have, they're strong rope ladders, but the pilot boat will pull alongside the ship. The pilot, who is the expert in the local waters, that's the function of a pilot. They're experts, and they're regionally employed to help dock large vessels. So the pilot is like the PhD of shipping, if you want to consider it that. So that guy, the PhD, the king of shipping, has to stand at the edge of a boat as they pull up to a rope ladder and just make a leap of faith. Yeah, exactly. I used to crew change by crew boat doing seismic research in the Gulf when I was working on smaller ships, and we had to crew change by just stepping across. There's two boats side by side. One of them has a portal that's open, and the crew boat has a little frame with a rope hanging from it, a knotted rope. And you hold on to the rope, and you just take a step and hope for the best. And I remember thinking at the time, we're towing millions of dollars worth of equipment here, mapping, miles beneath the ocean floor, and I've got a knotted rope. Thanks a lot. And guys would try to scare you too. If you're stepping across, the guy would tell you, the last guy that did that fell in the water, got sucked into the prop, and he's not with us anymore.
So now signal lights. You're on the crew, but do you know what the signal lights are for a tug with a tow aft, and how it's different from a tug with a tow abreast?
Yeah, I mean, I won't describe to you the different light signals. You need to know them to get your license. You need to, passed Coast Guard exams and stuff like that. Towing, towing astern, we had to have 3 mast lights when we had, a tow longer than a certain length. So these are the things that we use to identify, as the sailors, I'm sure, know other ships on the ocean, kind of where they're at, how much space they're taking up, and what kind of behavior you can expect of them.
And so now the length of tow lines, you're a master of the tow. And so when you're in port, the tow lines are shorter, but when you're out at sea, talk a little bit about the length of tow lines relative to the length of the boat and the length of the barge or whatever.
When we were towing on the Aleutian chain, I mean, we would have like 6,000 feet of wire behind us.
6,000 feet is a little more than a mile.
Yeah, so about a mile of wire behind us, somewhere in there. And that's because the more wire you have out behind the ship, behind the boat, the less strain there's going to be on the wire, right? So, and also the less strain there's going to be on the barge itself. So if you can sail with that much space between you and the tow is actually going to be safer. There's going to be less risk of anything breaking on the barge itself. Whereas when you only have maybe 50 feet of wire, as you do when you're, or 100 feet, when you're getting close to a dock, when you're going through kind of constricted spaces, then you're putting more tension on that line, and it's a lot more jarring for the equipment.
That's because the line from the ship to the tow object, there's catenary curve in there, and that's like a shock absorber, basically between the tow and the ship.
Yes, and in the video where I'm showing us kind of streaming tow, we're starting to pay out wire behind the boat, and the barge is behind us. You can see chain there as well. That's what we make the tow off to, and the chain also acts as a kind of shock absorber, kind of contributing to that dulling, that effect of that jarring effect that happens in seas, right? When you go up a swell and the barge is on the back end of a different swell, that wire is going to come tight. And you want to do whatever you can, including having as much catenary as possible, to prevent that shock.
So now the Russians have way more icebreakers than us. They're basically kind of tons of work is going on in the Arctic with the Russians. I keep maintaining that they are in favor of global warming for one of many reasons. One is because if they can melt enough deep water north, they can have the first blue water shores, and for shipping for the Russians never had. But did you see much Russian activity in the Antarctic?
I mean, I know they have bases down there, and obviously, as I mentioned in the presentation, they have the largest contiguous ice core right now, which is 3,770 meters, I believe. So they're very active, and not only active, they're showing us up down there as well. We have one polar icebreaker, which is the Polar Star, which we followed into Antarctica. SeaCor, the company I work with, they also go into the Arctic in the summertime, the northern summertime. I think it's the vernal summer, and use the Polar Star there as well. The Polar Star breaks up ice off of Greenland for them. There used to be 2. It was built in 1976. The other is just parts for the Polar Star now. They don't manufacture those parts anymore. So it's inevitable that is also going to stop working soon, and we will have no icebreakers. So there's a movement to build more. So
now I love asking questions, but if you'll raise your hand, we'll bring a mic to you. We'd love to have any questions from the audience at all. Yes, here's one mic. John, bring the mic over. Great. How do whales breathe when they're going under these icebergs?
Well, that I don't know, but I've seen them pop up when there's
an opening.
Exactly. So I know they're there. Yeah.
Amazing. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm Ron, Amy. On long ocean passages, I've run into these long ocean tows, a mile apart. And you really have to be alert and hope your visibility is good to see the 3 white lights. Otherwise, you're going to be sailing in between the barge and the tug, which you could do without knowing it, but not for sure.
It's the biggest fear that everybody has. I just went up and down the coast a bit, and when you're down there and you see ships, you're thinking, okay, so there's a ship, but where's the barge? He's towing something, or isn't he? Yeah, you're right. That's a mythical thing that's happened that sailors worry about, all of our lives, right?
I was just mentioning it because the race boats are between here and Hawaii. They're possibly going to cross paths with that.
Funny thing is, with all the Transpacks for 100 years and the Pacific Cups, the number of accidents, I think just one person has ever perished in. We really don't see that much commercial shipping when you go across. You really don't see much commercial shipping. Going up and down the coast, that's altogether different. And below the Santa Barbara Islands, ships are everywhere. So when we brought our powerboat up from San Diego a year ago, Mark was with us, and we were looking for ships, especially going off the LA basin. Big issue. Any other questions?
I was just going to mention one other thing, if you're interested about pirates. I've had experience off the China coast and the southern Philippines. And I was anchored in Manila, and old friends Lynn and Larry Pardee had done a lot of sailing. And we were comparing notes, and Peter and Lydia Tangold and their son Thomas was about 10 years old at the time. And we were saying, oh, don't go down to the southern Philippines, south of Mindanao, because they have all the weapons from Vietnam and such. And Lydia said, oh, we have a rifle on board, so I'm not going to worry about that. No, don't play games. And she did, and they were accosted by pirates. She got a rifle, and they shot her dead.
Not a good thing. Stay away from the pirates, right?
Anyway.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Magellan went around the world, in 1522, and he started out with five ships and 250 people, and it's like about 50 person per. The boats are about 80 feet long. You just told me that was 200 people for 5 ships that are, 60 or so, 50 feet long. You said that on 1,000 foot, you just have 20 guys. 20 guys. Is there 3 watches in that 20 guys or just 2 watches?
3 watches. Everybody does, the watchstanding mates do 4 hours on, 8 hours off. So if you work 4 to 8 a.m., you work 4 to 8 p.m. or 16 to 20, right? So that's and then you get your overtime during your 8 hours off if you want to keep working, but you have to be on the bridge, navigating for 8 hours a day in those 4-hour increments.
So you've told us a scary story. Tell us something funny that's happened at sea.
Something funny at sea? I mean, I've got a lot of really inappropriate funny stories. It's but so maybe
While you're pondering that, if we have a question here, get your story typed. We'll be ready. Yes, sir.
Hi, Josh. Total respect. Thank you. Great presentation.
Yes, good presentation. Very good presentation.
But in the and I could ask you this later, but in the adage, as a former teacher, if you have a question, probably other people have it too. So Scott made it all the way up, only to find out he was Johnny-come-lately and found the note, perished on the way back. How did they get the note?
I don't know. I can't say for sure how they got it, or even if they do have it. But Roald Amundsen survived, so he was the guy who wrote the note. So maybe he told people. I don't know. I don't think that's something that I would tell people if I had left that note. But, he was a different kind of...
Listen, Josh, it's been great listening to stories about sea from people who actually know what the heck they're doing on a boat and a ship. Thank you very much for being our guest on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Good going, mate.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, appreciate it.
Good going, mate. We're adjourned.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.